The People's Business is made possible by our partners, Solar Dynamics, the most efficient energy systems.
Good evening and welcome to The People's Business. I'm Wendy Burke. Today we are going to be looking at gender, disaster and recovery. What is it all about? To help us discuss the topic this evening are Ms. Andria Grosvenor, who's the Deputy Executive Director Acting of CDEMA, Dr. Debra, a lecturer in social work in the Department of Governance and Sociology at the UWI, and Dr. Halimah Deshong, the Senior Lecturer and Head of the Institute for Gender Development. Welcome, good evening, these ladies. Now, we also want to welcome our viewers to the program. Remember, you'll get a chance to call us later. But let's go to break, and when we come back, we'll unpack this topic. And we're back. Yes, welcome once again. Gender disaster and recovery. In order to help us understand exactly what we're talking about or why the issue of gender even needs to be factored in when we're talking about disaster recovery, I'll go to my panelists now so we can perhaps get a breakdown of the topic and what we're thinking of. And I'll head straight to you, Dr. Deshong.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for having all of us on this program. I think it's really important for us to think about gender recovery, disaster risk, because our societies are stratified by gender. So if we take that as a starting point, and what I mean is that resources are allocated differently based on the current relations of gender. If we think about take one example of how gender functions differently for women and men, we could think about differences in the burden of care. So women are responsible for unpaid labor and care activities, in some cases 2 to 10 times more than men. This has a serious effect in how women respond to in disaster contexts and their capacity to recover. And oftentimes you could think about the ways in which a lot of the shelter managers, those providing healthcare responses, tend to be women, and the effects that may have on their own households. That's just one example. Another example could be in the fact that gender-based violence increases significantly for women and girls in disaster contexts. And you see reports of this in the context of COVID. You see the reports of this in the context of explosive volcanic eruptions, in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines last year. In the case of Haiti and the earthquakes, you heard about increased levels of sexual violence. And if we don't think about the ways in which gender affects disaster and there are gendered effects of disasters, then our planning and our capacity to recover will be seriously constrained by that. So the advocacy is around ensuring that our disaster risk management policies embed our gender responses, and likewise our national gender policies take into account the disaster context.
Okay, if I could go now to Dr. Joseph, and let's break it down from the social work aspect, because in terms of assessments, etc., that is when social workers come into play after hurricanes, after major fires, even after earthquakes or land slippage issues. What for you have been some of the major issues that a lot of these women would have expressed in terms of either getting the assistance during the disaster or how they had to interact with certain people during that time, be it rescuers, whoever it be?
Yes, thank you. Good night for having me. Yes, what we social work operates at the micro, meso, and macro level. The micro deals with the individual, the meso deals with groups, families, and the macro deals with communities. And I have done research after Hurricane Maria. I have a case study with a female headed household and two children. And then I recently concluded another research in Dominica, um, the issues affecting women, female headed households, post Hurricane Maria, 1 year after and 4 years after. And the issues are dire because the situation 1 year after is nearly the same as 4 years after. Why? Because COVID came and impacted the women's recovery in terms of jobs and investment and being able to take care of their families. As Halimah said, women are the nurturers and the caregivers in the home, and they are very frustrated in that regard in terms of being able to provide for their families and their loved ones.
Right.
What happened after Hurricane Maria in Dominica? A lot of families had to double up in homes and had to come together. And you will find, like some of the women I interviewed, they were taking care of a lot of family members in the home. One was even taking care of two babies, and they could not get pampers, they could not get milk, and it was really, really difficult for them. So what they wanted, what they got was really informal social support in terms from family and friends and the community. So you find the formal support, they wanted more, but they really, really banded together and supported each other in
Okay.
terms of community. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
And
Andria of CDEMA would be able to tell us about that formal support because they are one of the players that engages across the board, across the Caribbean, to be able to give support in times of disaster. What has been CDEMA's findings in this issue of gender disaster and recovery, Andrea?
Thank you very much for having Sidima on the People's Business. It was really a pleasure to also share this panel with my colleagues. This is a very critical issue. Gender equality is very important. We need to understand the roles that um, women and girls, as well as men and boys, play in society. We need to understand how disasters affect them differently, and as my colleagues indicated, we know that women are quite vulnerable as it relates to disasters and also in their recovery due to the things that they have already put on the table. So, to tell us a little bit about Sedema and and its work, and to also open up the conversation uh, quite widely, as you know, Sedema is the regional agency established by the heads of government of the Caribbean community to provide oversight to disaster risk management in the Caribbean region. So we address multiple hazards. You've seen us in 2017 with responses to Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Virgin Islands and Dominica, respectively. You have also seen us providing responses in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as it relates to the volcanic emergency. And through those experiences, we have been able to gather quite a bit. I mean, we can also talk about experiences that we've had in 2004 with Hurricane Ivan and Grenada. And I cite that because I think this was one of the emergencies that the whole issue of gender came to the fore in a very clear way that the agency would have had to address in a very meaningful way. So we harness the collective capabilities of the region, including the private sector, and also complement that with international assistance as part of the regional response mechanism to provide assistance to a state once they have been impacted. So many persons know a lot about Sedema, for instance, from the Dominica's the impact of Maria, where we had over 500 boots on the ground providing support in various ways, relief supplies management, emergency operations centers management, and various other aspects to assist the government and the people of Dominica. When we look at the issue of gender, we recognize that women, yes, are particularly vulnerable in spite of the fact that we have international agreements on how we treat with women. They are often quite adversely affected in by disaster impacts. Females headed households are particularly vulnerable, as indicated even in the shelter environment. There are lots of issues. I want to open it up a little bit though to say that even as we consider the issues of women and girls and their specific vulnerability, and we need to shed a significant spotlight on them, we are also noticing and that there is also some vulnerabilities as it relates to men, particularly older men. And in 2004, PAHO had done a study in Grenada, and this is one of the issues that came up because they found that many men, older men, were in shelters and they needed adequate attention. And I will say to you that only recently, as I was looking through the raw data for shelters, for even a threat of a hurricane, you saw a large percentage of the persons who occupied shelters, there were elderly men. And so we need to understand how these issues are affecting society so that we can be able to articulate policies and programs and arrangements that allows us to treat with the vulnerability that occurs in society based on gender.
Okay.
So with the older men, and I'll wrap up with the
Mhm.
older men, it is also about their connection to family and how many times, because we have had situations where men may have more than one families, they're often not connected to those families in their older age, and therefore they become vulnerable as it relates to disaster situations.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly ask Dr. Joseph about the issue of LBGTQ because we're talking gender male and female, but as you know, others are here now. So, have you found in terms of disasters that this particular grouping have had any issues either in getting assistance or, for example, in being rescued? Have you heard any discrimination stories?
Yes, sad to say they are a marginalized group and they are very vocal about their needs and what is happening with them, and they will say it on the media, they will say it on the newspapers, they will say it on the television. You know, being a marginalized group, sorry, yeah, it's they are rendered sort of invisible. So if you are rendered invisible to begin with, naturally in society, when a disaster strikes, then nobody will really pay attention to you in a crisis. And that is the crux of the issue.
And it's an
Yeah.
unfortunate one. When we come back, we'll go into that a bit deeper, though, the whole issue of discrimination among the sexes and the response, and whether or not it is deliberately delayed or denied in terms of disaster recovery. We'll take a break and be back in a moment. Now, before we open back up the discussion, just to let our viewers know that this is the part where you can call in and share your experiences or ask any questions as relates to gender and disaster. You can reach us at 228-5562, 228-5563 if you want to raise anything with any of our panelists. Now, before we went off, we were speaking to the issue of discrimination. Now, for me, having worked within an agency which does first responder work, it was never an issue of whether you were color, your gender, your race, none of those issues. If you need assistance, you need assistance, full stop. However, I can see your face, Andrea. She's like, yeah, if only it were that simple, right? Yes, but that's the unfortunate thing when it comes to rescue. And not only the discrimination do I want to look at, but I want to look at that issue of violence and people trying to take advantage and manipulate a situation. Because there were instances in which people who were dislocated and figured that they got to a safer haven because they were staying with someone they knew and they loved, then found themselves in an even more vulnerable state with attempts at rape, and because, you know, they could not, the advances could not be fully pursued, then they were told to find somewhere else. And whilst there wasn't all clear, it still wasn't all good out there. You know, people were distanced from shelters, what have you. They had nothing to take with them to a shelter. So I think I'm going to let Andria respond to me first. She seems to have experienced quite a bit based on her facial expression.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. I think that it is very important that we recognize that in a disaster situation, vulnerabilities within a society is often exposed, sometimes tenfold, twentyfold. And therefore, a lot of the challenges that we have within the normal course of action, issues of security, issues of access to basic needs, whether it's food or clothing or shelter, when disaster strikes, what happens is that those vulnerabilities are exposed, and therefore persons do not have access to a lot of the things that are needed. I want to say that the matter that we've put on the table as it relates to gender is an issue that is quite complex. And I want to be very open from me as personally, because I am on this panel, and I will have my opinions, and I do have a Judeo-Christian worldview, and that is true. And however, that does not in any way um, mean that I am anyway not absolutely concerned about persons who may choose a different lifestyle uh, than I than I may choose. They are people who are to be treated with decency. There are to be people who are to be treated humanely, and therefore, even as we consider many of the things that could affect persons who may choose a different lifestyle, we have to be very much humanitarian in the way that we treat them and the way that we are able to ensure that adequate arrangements are put in place, that they have access to the needs that they would have, just as
Okay.
we would do women, and just as we would girls, and just as we would men. These are things that we have to grapple with as a society, because we are required to be humanitarian in our approaches.
Okay, we have a caller on the line. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Good evening. Good
Go,
evening. Good
go right
evening.
ahead, sir.
Yeah, I want to ask, connect to the panel. I want to ask the panel to explain to me properly how gender ties in to disaster, because that is just a topic, and you can come and say gender ties into the thing, but explain to me how it becomes gender to tie into this disaster, because tell me how they see at a fine point that this gender ties into disaster. I want to hear that from the panel.
Okay, he's asking about the correlation between gender and disaster. How does it really tie in? Dr. Deshong?
Thank you, Wendy. I think up front it might have been useful to just explain what we mean by gender. When we talk about gender, we talk about the ways in which um, society is organized and creates particular understandings of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and how sometimes those very rigid assumptions about manhood and womanhood do not always reflect a diverse set of experiences of gender. Suppose there's some persons who do not conform to these normative ideas about gender, and they might identify as LGBT, or they might identify as gender non-conforming. And so, regardless to a person's gender identity, they should not experience discrimination. They should not be lack of access to resources. But unfortunately, that does occur. So when the issue about how the experiences, some research I recently conducted in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, one of the concerns they had was that persons who do not conform to normative expressions of gender are not necessarily presenting at the shelter, not because they do not have issues related to homelessness and displacement, but because the shelter is not necessarily seen as a safe space because of the existing, and not just specific to St. Vincent and the Grenadines or the Caribbean, but the wider world, because of existing homophobia, transphobia, and so on. And by that I mean discrimination that will be experienced by a person who might identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, or just generally gender nonconforming. And those are realities. The other way in which gender connects to disaster is that you have a reality, for instance, water management in households where you have to actually, you don't have running water and you actually have to fetch water. By and large, those tend to be women headed households, and women are often responsible for procuring those resources. In the absence of access to water because of a disaster, that places sometimes women at particular risk because of how far they may have to travel to procure water. We also see, even though there are differences in how men and women are affected, I know that Andrea mentioned the issue of the elderly, but we could think about persons with disabilities, we could think about children, youth. And when we talk about women, we are talking about specifically economically disadvantaged women whose experience of disaster is far more acute. So you present at the shelters. The shelters is a place that sometimes might not necessarily be safe because they're exposed to sexual violence. One of the reports we heard out of the experience of the explosive volcanic eruptions and shelters is that men actually increase their alcohol use, which is something we see with natural disasters, and that also increased violence against women and girls. But I also found something interesting in doing that research is that there were a few young girls who were reporting this, that they saw the public shelters as an escape from sexual violence they were experiencing in home from family members. So you have a complex set of experiences because oftentimes the support systems fall out, especially the state support systems in the context of a disaster, to experiences of violence. And one more thing I will say on this is that you need to see more diverse representation, women, persons affected by poverty, in terms of disaster risk management, planning, and governance,
Okay,
because
Dr. Deshong,
the
we have
effects
another
are so
caller on
different.
the
I'll stop
line, so
there.
I just want to let them in
Okay.
before our next break. Good evening to you.
Hi, good evening.
Go straight ahead.
Hi, good evening.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, so my question is this. So I'm aware that there is gender inequality in society as a whole, but what I want to find out is there a percentage shift when there is a disaster? Does that gap widen, and is there a statistic on how wide that gap is?
Interesting. Do you want to take this one, Dr. Joseph?
It's okay. Yes, the guidance, because it was found that during disaster, women are more prone to injuries and are less likely to survive because they don't have access to decision-making processes and don't really have a say, and they don't have access to certain resources. So evidence has shown that most women are injured and may not survive a disaster as compared to men. I don't have the exact figure, but it's out there. But the gap is widened. in a disaster with respect to women. Yeah.
Okay. And Andrea, in terms of the uptake of access to the shelters and any the rescues from any of the disaster agencies, do you find that it is generally more women, vulnerable women with children, who tend to come forward for this assistance?
That's an excellent question, Wendy. I want to start the answer by talking about this whole matter, the connection that the caller asked about, which was well explained, and just expand on that. The why gender and disaster management is linked is because of the roles that people play in society, whether it's men or women, and we know that sometimes those traditional roles can shift. What we find is that, for instance, we know that if, to take your example of the shelter, many men may say, take the children, and the female may go to the shelter with the children while the man may stay at home. We see this sometimes, they're trying to guard their homes and they're trying to guard their possessions, and depending on the strength of the storm, that can put the men at risk as well. We also know that females and the girls in shelters can also put them also at risk based on the shelter environment. We also know that there are some roles that we see. Like, for instance, we know that after and because we were talking about recovery as well, after you have an event, we talk about this issue of unpaid care. So after an event, we will find that men tend to get get employment. So they may get employment as it relates to um, building back homes or even for road clearing and that sort of thing. But women are often at home, they're taking care of the children because the children are not in school, they're taking care of the elderly and other persons in the family. And so, therefore, they don't always have access then to employment when we're thinking about recovery. So it is because this is how gender and disaster management get linked, because there are roles that are traditional roles, and we know sometimes that those roles can be reversed. But based on the roles that people play, it means that in a disaster situation, that they can be more vulnerable because of the roles that they play, and women, because of that unpaid care and those type of things make them more vulnerable. But then we also have the males and their machismo. We see the man staying at home in St. Vincent and Grenadines, or even in Guyana with the floods in 1995. We found that more men got leptospirosis because those were the men who were walking through the waters, um, you know, you know, also rescuing persons and whatever. But then they were also reluctant to take the medication. So you also have to find another strategy to encourage them to take the medication and those type of things. So it's the roles that we play that often sometimes can make us most vulnerable when it comes to disaster management situations.
Okay, now let's quickly look at another role that some women play in disaster recovery. Take yourself, for example, second in command at CDEMA. Let's look at our shelter wardens. The responsibility of getting it all together and getting it right falls on the shoulders of women most of the time. Let's look at the DEOs, for example, in Barbados. A number of the constituencies are headed up by women. So let's look at that
Yeah.
quickly before we go to break.
Can I
Well,
say very
absolutely.
Go ahead, Halimah.
Go right ahead.
very quickly, and I'm happy that you spoke to that, because those very stratified roles that exist pre-disaster, you see them even going further apart. So we have to say, for instance, think about the security officers, police, and other security officers, by and large men. And on the other hand, you have our nurses or teachers who tend to go into those roles as especially teachers, shelter managers, and so on. And they kind of mimic in many ways the kind of sexual division of labor. In a disaster context, that is even more acute, because some of the reports I was getting, some of those very shelter managers were placed under pressure from family members who felt they were spending too much time without coming home to their households for families. And this, in some cases, led to them experiencing violence. And I think in organizing and planning for recovery, planning for rebuilding, we have to think about the ways in which, in some very acute ways, our societies remain stratified by gender and what this means in a disaster context.
Okay, we're going to go to break, and when we come back, we'll look at some more issues as it relates to gender disaster and recovery. We'll be back in a moment. And we're back. If you've just joined us, our panelists are Dr. Halimah Deshong, Andria Grosvenor, and Dr. Debra Joseph. We're having our social workers, our gender and development institute heads, as well as the Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA with us to try to unpack the topic of gender disaster and recovery. But before we go back to the discussion, ladies, let's take this call. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. This question is for Dr. Joseph.
Go right ahead.
Do you have any psychosocial tips for self-recovery?
Can you repeat?
Do you have any psychosocial tips for self-recovery? For example, you may have the government assisting persons, but persons need to assist themselves as well. So do you have any tips for the public with respect to prevention?
Okay, I'll go to Andria first, and then Debra, perhaps, who looks at it from the social setting. Any tips, Andria?
Yes, definitely. I'm so happy that the caller would have put the whole idea of recovery and self-recovery on the table. So, we tend to think about preparedness for responding, but it's very important that we also consider preparedness for recovery. And so, when we are looking at, we have to plan, for if we are impacted, how we would respond, but we also have to plan in terms of how do we cope in a situation if we are impacted. So we know that we may potentially, if a disaster occurs in a country, remember every hazard impact is not a disaster. You may have a hurricane, but the country may be able to cope, and therefore it's not a disaster. But it may be a disaster for some people. So Hurricane Elsa was not a disaster for the whole country, but it was a disaster for some people. But it is important that you have an understanding that you may potentially be impacted, and therefore you need to, when you're planning with your family as it relates to planning for a response, you also should plan for recovery. So when you're thinking about recovery, it's not going to look probably the same way as before you were impacted. So you have to look at what are those minimum things that you would want to do, things that you might want to undertake in terms of counseling, things that you might want to, in terms of your family and what you hold dear, those things that you might want to ensure that you preserve, that it will also give you the opportunity to recover and to also have a peace of mind. So I think that the planning matters are important. Planning for your response, planning for your recovery as a family in terms of what do you do to get back on your feet, what resources you have, whether it will be savings or what you get from the insurance. These are the type of things that give you peace of mind, but also planning in terms of what are you going to tackle first, in terms of maybe you might not be able to repair the whole house, but you might be able to repair at least sufficient that you are able to be comfortable. But I think the important thing is that if you're thinking about self recovery, you have to look at what things you can do to restore, as quickly as possible your life to some set of normalcy in terms of even normal routines, but also then you also have to think about maybe those issues that you have to treat in terms of the livelihoods. You know, maybe even if you're a farmer, or if you're self-employed, or if it relates to your employment. These are the things that planning ahead becomes critically important. We support countries at the national level in terms of their model national recovery frameworks, and also establishing mechanisms for recovery at the national level. But it's important that at the individual level that you do also put those things in place post disaster.
Okay, over to you now, Deborah. In terms of
Yes, hi.
basics, yes.
Yes, in social work, we look at the community for self recovery. It's always good to reach out to those in the community. When a psychosocial team went to the communities in Dominica after Tropical Storm Erica, we found that a lot of persons were able to be aided in self recovery by those their neighbors. Persons were able to, support each other in terms of meals, in terms of emotional support, because they were all in the same boat. So you cannot, even though you prepare, at that stage, you have to reach out and you have to come together as a community. And
Okay,
that's where social workers get involved in like macro practice. So
okay,
community is very important for self recovery.
okay. We have another caller on the line. Good evening.
Hello, good evening, ma'am.
Yes, go right ahead.
Just raising a query as to why should disaster and recovery be genderized? Should we be looking at it from a holistic perspective as affecting people?
I'm going to give that one to you, Halimah.
I'll say very simply, because our society, whether we accept it or not, is organized, our societies are organized along gendered lines. For us to just use a kind of one size fits all approach to address the sort of fallout that happens in the context of disaster means that we are going to miss very important specificities. So if we take an analysis of how the society is organized pre-disaster, we see what the inequalities are. So when governments and civil society and all stakeholders are planning, they have to think about the specific vulnerabilities, the specific strengths which exist. And one of the unfortunate ways in which society is organized in uneven ways is in sort of gendered ways. So when we say, if we do take a holistic look, that holistic look on has to take into account gender. And I think we gave a lot of examples as to why. I think one of the ways in which we have to think about recovery and think about economic recovery, if I use one example, take the fisheries. Um, if for fisher folk, when a disaster strikes, let's take hurricane, men in particular, men who are the ones who go by and large out to fish, have to wait for things to turn around in terms of access to the boats, etc. Women who might be in the process industry, that will take an even longer time. But those women also in those households that tend to be sometimes lower middle class, lower socioeconomic brackets, they also are navigating the financial fallout as well as the increased burden of care. If we don't take account of those gender specificities, it means that we don't plan in very important and specific ways to recover. And so it's really to look at the ways in which societies are organized, taking persons with disabilities who we oftentimes do not account for in a lot of things affecting society. Then we are going to miss and continue to leave too many persons behind. And thinking about the leadership that all groups of people could provide in terms of disaster planning and recovery becomes also very important. So it's really about ensuring that we capture specific vulnerabilities, specific strengths across gender, class, race, ability, etc.
I'm glad there's one line there that sticks out, how society is organized. And I think that's why the question as to why gender should factor in will be raised, because I believe some probably take it for granted that if women continue to do it now, and they pull whatever resources they have out of the hat and get everything done, why should a disaster be any different? Why should a storm or an earthquake or a flood, why should that factor in any differently in terms of how they manage the day-to-day things of the household and of the children? Let's take, for example, when we are trying to resettle, yeah? Debra had mentioned the issue of, I think it was Debra, of having different homes and, you know, men not being in a particular space. Okay, we'll go to a call shortly. But I realized that in the resettling, a lot of women have to get back to the homes on their own with all the children in tow and everything that they would have taken to the shelter. You spoke to having the community help. Yes, you did, Debra. That helps sometimes. But then there are other times where there is a male present, but somehow in a disaster situation, he becomes extremely absent. And it has nothing to do with the rebuilding of the society. Don't just all be awestruck, ladies. I'm going to go to you, Debra, because I don't know if maybe there's a particular something going on mentally for them that makes them unable to cope at that time. I don't know. What's the trigger there?
You mean men?
Yes.
For the men?
When they do not assist in any way in the resettling of the family.
Okay, I wouldn't generalize, but there are some men who help, because the case study that I did with the female-headed household and the 2 children, she sent her children to Barbados and she stayed back to take care of the home without a roof. And the persons in the community, males, they came every time she needed help to sweep, to fix, to help with the flooding and everything. And on more than one occasion, I'm just talking about that case. So they were there and they were available and they were willing in this instance. So I wouldn't generalize to say, you know, generally men don't. I think each situation is unique, and it's good to look a bit closer at what is happening, because that she got all the help she needed from males in that neighborhood.
She's a lucky
Yes.
one.
Yes.
She's a truly lucky one. We have a caller. Good evening.
Hello, good evening.
Yes. Could you speak a little louder for me and then go right ahead?
Yes, good evening. The community is very important to getting together in times of disaster. And I find automatically, though, most of the time this is done. And people come out. Sometimes people live even better during disaster, so let us keep that hope up. But I'm wondering, y'all just said something about men not being available. I was watching disaster areas, and I see men working hard. And I'm wondering how come y'all don't even have a man here to speak out as to how they feel during disasters or represent the men. There are 3 women here. So I think getting a man on board in these things would be very important. Thank you.
You're most welcome. I agree with her. A man should be there. Where are they? As I said, let's look at how it all boils down at the end of the day. And I find what you said, Halimah, a little distressing, that you would have a teacher, a senior teacher, a principal, you know, or in charge of a shelter or some other civic organization, and that on returning home, they would find themselves, you know, the victims of some level of abuse or you know, discrimination because they're just being humanitarian. That's a bit disconcerting for me. But Yes,
Can I
men do
just
help. Our soldiers are always out there. Most of them are male. We can't dispute that. I'm not sure how it is in the other Caribbean territories, but I can
absolutely?
tell you I support the BDF all the way. They are always, always, always there in all times of disaster. Go ahead, Halimah.
I was just going to say that the Caribbean people have a very great capacity for compassion, and I do think that in times of disaster there is a very strong sense of community, an even heightened sense of community. So I do agree with the point that Dr. Joseph and even the caller made about our sense of community, and that heightens with disaster. And I also do agree that, and I like the example that Dr. Joseph used about how men help in the context of recovery. And that has been what I have observed. I think we when we talk about the situation with the shelters, we are talking about a very specific gendered experience of violence against women and girls, which is a different dynamic there. And I would say that, it's really important for us to think about the ways, even though we might have a heightened focus on women in some regards, absolutely, in terms of security and so on, men are by and large security officers, they're by and large police officers, and their role is indispensable in the context of a disaster. Um, and I do think we need to reflect that. I don't know if, in terms of the selection of the panel this evening, CDC chose people based on their expertise, but I do see men are often engaged in the conversation around disaster management. If we think about the persons working in national disaster agencies, in the region and at the national level, we do have men represented. But what we have to also remember is that a lot of the planning around disaster, around policies, national policies for disaster, happens at the kind of governmental level, and the extent to which women and women who made most vulnerable, the elderly, persons with disabilities, LGBT persons are represented in the planning and organizing outside of at the level of civil society, I am not sure. So I think there's a need for, in terms of thinking about governance and planning and decision making, that the representation needs to be more diverse.
Okay, we'll go to break now, ladies, and when we come back, we'll look to unpack some of these other things and perhaps look a little bit more acutely at men and their roles in disaster and recovery. We'll be back after the break. Okay. Have room for two, only two, yeah. And we're back, and we're going to go straight to the phone lines. Good evening to you.
Yes, good evening. Just want to make one comment. And it is this. Very often a disaster, when it comes, is what really highlights the problems that exist even before the disaster came. And my opinion is just that if we can get some of these issues of gender resolved, even in normal times, when the disaster comes, we will just automatically go into... So in other words, if men and women are taught to be sensitive to each other, men are taught to be sensitive to women, and women are taught to be sensitive to men, when the disaster comes, we will automatically act like men, and women will automatically act like women and show concern for those who are in trouble. A disaster cannot solve the problem. And whether the disaster is a hurricane or a problem in the family, very often these disasters only reflect the problems that have been there before. A hurricane or planning for a hurricane or all the things that are involved with the planning cannot solve the problem that exists in society as the norm. Thank you.
Well said, caller. And he is true. Sometimes it just takes a situation to make all that is wrong beneath the surface unravel. And I think I'm going to go straight to you for this one, Debra. Um,
Uh-huh.
in terms of trying to settle some of these issues so that we don't have these situations become the end all and be all when we're in a disaster and recovery state.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, the caller is so correct because climate change is a threat multiplier. It escalates tensions socially, politically, and economically. So he's correct. So all of that just increases because it was existing before and it increases. So awareness is key and education is key and preparedness is key to everything. That awareness of the disparities between men and women during disasters is important. Education along those lines is important. So once you are aware, you know you will move accordingly and to suit. I want to revisit the men in disasters. The case study I did, the female-headed household, she had a son. So I asked him, would your family survive? He had a sister and his mother. I said, would your family have gone okay without you in the home? He said, they may, but my presence helped them a lot because there are certain things that I could do that they may not be able to do, like lift the plywood, lift the mattress, do the heavy work, you know? And another thing he put a plug in for is that when he went to get the phone calls out to his friends and family, he had to walk to Roseau and he decided to put on his cadet uniform. I said, why put on your cadet uniform? He said, people respect uniforms and it could help him to get to where he wants to easier. Because he said, when you walk with a uniform, people will say, yes, sir. You know, what do you want, sir? You know, that sort of respect. And he decided to do that and walk miles and miles, you know, putting himself in danger to get to a cell tower to make phone calls to tell his family that they are okay. And I want to put in a plug for that cadet, you know, that cadet movement in schools, because he said it's military and it helped him to help his family so much during Hurricane Maria, you know, and he was there for them. He was able to go into action. And he said he would not have been able to do that without being in the cadet. So
Okay.
maybe we can look at that also, you know, in terms of training boys and maybe girls with the Girl Guides and so forth, in terms of put it as part of their training, the disaster management and preparedness, because
Correct.
that helped a lot. Yes.
Andrea, is there any scope or are there any programs ongoing right now across the region to help train or teens who might be within vulnerable households?
Absolutely. We do quite a bit of work, a number of actors in civil society, and also with the disaster offices, National Disaster Office, also with the Red Cross and other actors in civil society. We do training of community emergency response teams where we are able to teach them how to be able to support the community in terms of providing the response. And this aspect of a community emergency response team, this can actually be expanded. We can have emergency response teams in schools and various other areas. We talked very well about the cadets. One of the other groups is also the scouts. And we know, for instance, that one of the things that have been pushed in a number of the scouting fraternity is related to how to assist with communications, emergency communications, the use of the ham radio and other technologies. So these groups actually really can be strengthened to support the community. I want to say that at the end of the day, we're talking about gender and disaster management and recovery, gender disaster and recovery. Societies thrive when when we when males and females, they work together. And I think that's an important point that we want to underscore. We recognize that they may take on different roles, and as they take on different roles, their strengths or their vulnerabilities may come to the fore. But we need to be able to understand them so that when we are undertaking our policy actions, that we don't miss those who really need the support. And I think that this is the critical point. We cannot be able to provide support on response and recovery to a society carte blanche. It wouldn't be one size fits all. But if, as we understand how they are differently affected, then we are able to put in place appropriate policy arrangements, whether it be psychosocial support, whether it would be support with assistance in terms of taking care of families, whether it's in terms of provision of relief supplies, or even materials for to support self recovery, or supporting them in psychosocially. We
Okay.
need to understand how they act differently so that we can be able to meet them where they're at.
Okay, Halimah, 30 quick seconds in terms of this topic. What's the first thing you think we need to do to address it?
I think there's a need. I want to underscore the points made before about the need for public education and to make sure we mainstream issues related to gender, clear understanding of gender, to disaster recovery, disaster risk management, preparedness, and so on. And that it needs to happen at every level. I would say that to the extent that there's a platform in government with civil society, the need for us to make sure that we have multi-sectoral, properly represented planning and properly resource planning, and
Okay.
that understanding should be mainstream throughout all our work with a very high level of public education and engagement.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists this evening for joining us on the topic, gender disaster and recovery. Unfortunately, we're out of time, ladies, but I want to thank Andria Grosvenor, who is the Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA, Dr. Debra Joseph, who's a lecturer in social work at the UWI, and Dr. Halimah Deshong, the Senior Lecturer and Head of the Institute for Gender Development at the Cave Hill campus. Ladies, again, I want to thank you very much as we unpack this topic, because, you know, we still are within the hurricane season and some of these issues will raise their heads. So let's hope that tonight's program gave you some insight and that you will be a bit more sensitive to the needs of others as we go forward. It's been a pleasure bringing it to you this evening. I'm Wendy Burke. Do enjoy your Sunday.